At my husband's funeral, I received a message. Our children planned everything. Trust no one. The church was full of flowers, quiet whispers, and the heavy weight of grief. I stood beside my husband's coffin, trying to accept the sudden accident that had taken him from us. Everyone kept telling me the same thing. Be strong for the children. Our sons organized everything. The funeral, the legal paperwork, even the quick cremation they insisted was what Dad would have wanted. Then, while people were offering condolences, my phone vibrated. An unknown number. A single message appeared on the screen. Our children planned everything. Trust no one. My heart stopped. The message was sent from my husband's private encrypted account, one that only he knew how to access. Suddenly, the accident didn't feel like an accident anymore. And the two young men crying beside the coffin might be hiding something far darker than grief. If this story helps you understand that greed can poison even family bonds, please like and subscribe. There are moments when grief becomes complicated by suspicion, when loss is contaminated by doubt, when the natural process of mourning is interrupted by growing recognition that something about the official story doesn't align with what you know to be true. Standing beside my husband Thomas's coffin during his funeral service, surrounded by flowers and condolences, and our two adult sons who'd organized every detail of the service with efficiency that had seemed touching at first, but that was beginning to feel increasingly suspicious. I received a text message that would transform my grief into investigation, and would reveal that the sudden accident that had killed my husband might not have been accident at all, but rather something far more calculated and far more devastating. A scheme orchestrated by our own children to access inheritance they weren't willing to wait for. My name is Catherine Morrison, and I'm 56 years old. My husband Thomas was 58 when he died, successful businessman who'd built substantial wealth through career and commercial development and through smart investments over decades. We had two sons, Marcus, who was 32, and Ryan, who was 29, both of whom we'd raised with every advantage and who we'd believed were building their own successful lives, independent of expectations of eventual inheritance. The accident that had killed Thomas had occurred 10 days before the funeral. Sudden single-car crash on highway he drove regularly. Vehicle that had apparently lost control and struck barrier at high speed. The police investigation had concluded it was tragic accident, possibly result of medical event like heart attack or stroke while driving, possibly momentary distraction or error in judgment, nothing suspicious or criminal about it. Thomas had been alone in the car. Death had been instantaneous, according to medical examiner. There were no witnesses or evidence suggesting anything other than unfortunate accident. Marcus and Ryan had been devastated, or so it had seemed. They'd cried at the hospital when we'd received the news, had been supportive and helpful in the immediate aftermath, had taken over organizing funeral arrangements and handling immediate logistical matters, while I'd been paralyzed with grief and shock. They'd made decisions quickly. Immediate cremation, because Dad wouldn't want people staring at his body, quick funeral service, so Mom doesn't have to endure prolonged mourning process, efficient handling of estate paperwork to make things easier during this difficult time. At the time, their efficiency had seemed like blessing, like caring sons taking burden off grieving widow who couldn't handle making these decisions herself. But looking back with the suspicion the text message had created, their speed and their control over every aspect of the process was beginning to seem less like support and more like orchestrated management of situation designed to prevent scrutiny or questions. The text message had arrived during the funeral reception, while people were offering condolences and sharing memories of Thomas. My phone had vibrated in my pocket, and when I'd checked it discreetly, I'd seen message from number I didn't recognize. Our children planned everything. Trust no one. The sender information had shown it came from email account I recognized immediately, even though I'd never had reason to contact it. Thomas's private encrypted email account that he used for sensitive business communications, account he'd been extremely protective of, and that he'd never shared access to with anyone including me. The fact that message was coming from that account meant either someone had hacked it after Thomas's death, or Thomas himself had set up delayed message to be sent in event of his death, message warning me about our children and about their involvement in whatever had happened to him. I'd felt my heart stop, had felt wave of nausea and disorientation as the implications of the message crashed over me. Our children planned everything, not the funeral arrangements, everything, including whatever had led to Thomas's death. Trust no one, not even our sons, not even the people who were standing beside me crying and accepting condolences for loss of their father. I'd managed to maintain composure through remainder of the reception, had accepted condolences and had thanked people for coming while internally processing the message and what it might mean. After everyone had left and Marcus and Ryan had gone back to their respective homes, I'd sat alone in my house and had started trying to access Thomas's encrypted email account to see if there were other messages or information that would explain the warning he'd apparently sent. The account required password I didn't know, but Thomas had been predictable about certain things, and after several attempts, I'd managed to access it using combination of significant dates and family information he typically used for passwords. What I'd found in the account had been limited. Thomas had apparently used it sparingly and had deleted most messages regularly. But there was one draft email that had never been sent, dated 3 weeks before his death, addressed to me. The draft email contained detailed explanation of what Thomas had discovered and what he'd been planning to do about it. Our sons, he'd written, had been living far beyond their means for the past several years, had accumulated significant debts through lifestyle expenses and failed business ventures they'd been hiding from us, had been counting on eventual inheritance to solve their financial problems. But when they'd learned that Thomas was planning to restructure his estate, to leave majority of his wealth to charitable foundation rather than to them directly, to provide them with modest trust funds that would give them financial security, but not the large liquid assets they'd apparently been expecting, they'd become desperate. Thomas had written that he'd overheard conversation between Marcus and Ryan discussing their financial situation and their anger about his estate planning changes, had heard them speculating about what would happen if he died before finalizing the new estate plan, had heard enough to make him concerned about his own safety. He'd been planning to confront them, but he'd also been setting up this automated message system that would send warning to me from his encrypted account if he died suddenly, before he'd had chance to address the situation with them directly. The email draft had included specific information about what Thomas suspected, that Marcus and Ryan had been researching ways to cause fatal car accident that would appear to be natural, had been asking questions about his regular driving routes and habits, had been showing unusual interest in his vehicle and his schedule. He'd been planning to secure evidence of their planning and to confront them with it, to give them chance to admit what they'd been considering, and to get help for their financial and emotional problems before they actually acted on what he believed were still just desperate fantasies rather than concrete plans. But apparently Thomas had been wrong about how far Marcus and Ryan were willing to go. The timing of his death, coming just days before he'd been scheduled to sign the paperwork for his new estate plan that would have significantly reduced their inheritance, suggested that they'd moved from fantasy to action, that they'd found some way to cause the car accident that had killed him before he could finalize the changes that would have destroyed their financial plans. Reading Thomas's draft email, understanding that he'd suspected our sons were planning to harm him and that his suspicions had apparently been correct, created grief that was even more devastating than the original loss. Thomas had died not in random accident, but in deliberate act orchestrated by our own children, people we'd raised and loved and trusted, people who'd apparently valued their inheritance more than they'd valued their father's life. The question was what to do with this information. The police had concluded the accident was natural, had no reason to investigate further unless new evidence suggested otherwise. I had Thomas's draft email suggesting he'd suspected our sons were planning to harm him, but I didn't have concrete proof that they'd actually done anything to cause the accident. And confronting them directly would give them opportunity to destroy any evidence and to present themselves as grieving sons, being accused by grief-stricken mother who wasn't thinking clearly. What I decided to do was investigate quietly while maintaining appearance of grieving widow who suspected nothing, to look for evidence that would either confirm or disprove Thomas's suspicions before taking any action that would alert Marcus and Ryan to what I'd discovered. I started by researching the accident more carefully, reviewing police reports, talking to accident investigators, examining Thomas's vehicle which had been stored at impound lot pending insurance processing. What I discovered through this investigation was troubling pattern of small inconsistencies that individually seemed explainable, but that collectively suggested the accident might not have been natural. The vehicle's brake system had shown signs of recent tampering that hadn't been noted in initial police investigation. Thomas's regular driving route had been slightly altered on day of accident in ways that had positioned him on more dangerous section of highway. There had been anonymous call to emergency services reporting the accident within minutes of when it must have occurred, too quickly for someone to have just happened upon it unless they'd been waiting and watching. None of this was definitive proof that Marcus and Ryan had caused the accident, but it was enough to justify asking more questions and potentially requesting police to reopen investigation. Before doing that, I consulted with an attorney who specialized in criminal defense and who could advise me on how to handle a situation where I suspected my own children of having caused their father's death. The attorney had been direct about challenges I'd face. Without concrete evidence that Marcus and Ryan had actually caused accident rather than just having motive and opportunity, criminal investigation was unlikely to result in charges. But there were other approaches. I could block them from accessing their inheritance pending investigation, could challenge the quick cremation they'd insisted on as destruction of evidence, could make clear that I was aware of what Thomas had suspected and that I was watching them carefully. What I ultimately decided was to confront Marcus and Ryan directly but strategically, in setting where I'd have witness and where their responses would be documented. I arranged meeting with them and with the attorney, told them I needed to discuss estate matters, and that I'd found some concerning information in Thomas's files that needed to be addressed. At the meeting, I'd presented them with Thomas's draft email and with the evidence I'd gathered suggesting the accident might not have been natural. I'd watched their faces as they'd read their father's suspicions about their planning and their motivations, had seen them shift from confusion to fear to defensive anger as they'd processed what I was showing them. Marcus had tried to dismiss it all as misunderstanding or as Thomas's paranoia in final weeks of his life, had insisted they'd never planned to harm their father, and that the timing of his death before finalizing new estate plan was just tragic coincidence. Ryan had been quieter, but had seemed more genuinely distressed, had shown signs of internal conflict that suggested he might have been involved, but might also have been having second thoughts or moral struggles about what they'd done. "I know what you did," I'd told them calmly. "Maybe I can't prove it definitively yet. Maybe the police investigation won't find enough evidence to charge you criminally. But I know. Your father knew. And I'm not going to let you benefit from his death." The estate settlement that followed was complex and contentious. I'd worked with attorneys to challenge the existing will on grounds that Thomas had been in process of changing it when he'd died, and that honoring his clear intent required implementing the charitable foundation structure he'd been planning, rather than the outdated will that gave majority of estate to Marcus and Ryan. The legal battle had taken over a year, and had required presenting evidence of Thomas's estate planning intentions and of the suspicious circumstances of his death. The final settlement had given Marcus and Ryan modest trust funds that provided them with basic financial security, but that were far less than they would have received under the original will, with majority of Thomas's estate going to establish charitable foundation in his name as he'd intended. More importantly, the investigation and the legal proceedings had made clear that I suspected them of having caused their father's death, even if that suspicion couldn't be proven criminally, had destroyed whatever remained of our family relationship, had ensured they understood there would be consequences even if those consequences were financial and social rather than criminal. 5 years after Thomas's death and after the devastating discovery that our sons had likely caused it in attempt to access their inheritance before he could change his estate plan, I'm 61 and living with grief that's complicated by knowledge of betrayal and by inability to fully prove what I'm certain is true. Marcus and Ryan and I have no relationship. They insist they were innocent and that I destroyed their family through false accusations motivated by grief and paranoia. I'm certain they caused their father's death, even if I can't prove it definitively enough for criminal prosecution. The charitable foundation Thomas had wanted to establish operates successfully and funds causes he cared about, serves as legacy that honors who he was and what he valued, rather than enriching the children who apparently valued their inheritance more than they valued his life. Whether Marcus and Ryan learned anything from the experience, or whether they simply resent that their plan didn't give them the financial windfall they'd been expecting, I don't know, and don't particularly care. What I learned from the text message that had arrived during Thomas's funeral, and from the investigation it had triggered, is that greed can poison even family bonds, that people will sometimes prioritize money over everything, including their relationship with parents who raised them and loved them. That inheritance can become motivation for unthinkable betrayals when people convince themselves they're entitled to wealth they haven't earned and aren't willing to wait for. Thomas's warning. Our children planned everything. Trust no one. Had been accurate, even though I'd initially found it almost impossible to believe our sons could have done what he was suggesting. The truth had been exactly as devastating as he'd warned it would be. My name is Catherine Morrison. At my husband's funeral, I received message from his encrypted account warning me that our children had planned everything and that I should trust no one. The investigation that followed revealed that our sons had likely caused their father's death to access their inheritance before he could finalize estate plan changes that would have significantly reduced what they'd receive. I couldn't prove it definitively enough for criminal charges, but I could ensure they didn't benefit from his death the way they'd planned, could redirect his estate to charitable purposes he'd intended, could make clear that betrayal has consequences even when legal system can't provide criminal accountability. Greed poisoned our family, destroyed our sons' relationship with their father and with me, turned what should have been natural grief into investigation and suspicion and permanent rupture. Some betrayals are so fundamental that relationships can't survive them, even when they're relationships between parents and children. Thank you for reading. If this story helps you understand that greed can poison even family bonds, please like and subscribe.